Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the webinar, Methods and Means for Peacebuilding, the third webinar in the series, Plowshare Vision, Peace to be Learned and Practiced. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as a Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement here at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C. For participants who are low vision, blind, or perhaps only listening, I'm a Korean American woman with dark brown eyes and black hair tied back, wearing a light gray shirt in front of a virtual blue-gray background. And I will be moderating this webinar with my colleague, Reverend Katie Monforte. A short overview of our time together. After the dialogue, there will be a time of Q&A led by Reverend Katie Monforte. So please enter your questions in the Q&A for our panelists, and you can find the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. And then we will end with closing announcements. I am honored to introduce you to our panelists for today. All of our speakers are experts in the field of peace building, and to share all of their experiences and accolades, our time together would abruptly come to an end. We will be spending all that time just hearing about their experiences and what they bring. So for the sake of time, I will share a short biography of each of our panelists, and please visit their full bio. The links will be dropped later on in the chat. Liz Hume is Executive Director at the Alliance for Peacebuilding. She is a conflict expert and has more than 25 years of experience in senior leadership positions in bilateral, multilateral institutions and NGOs. She has extensive experience in policy and advocacy and overseeing sizable and complex peace-building programs in conflict-affected and fragile states in Asia, Eastern Europe, and Africa. Paul Turner is the President and Executive Director of Fund for Peace. Prior to his current position, he was the Chief of Party overseeing a USAID mechanism focusing on governance and stabilization in the Middle East and North Africa. He has worked on more than 90 conflict-affected countries and was deployed to over 40 countries as a diplomat, activist, academic, researcher, and a peace builder. He was also raised and is a United Methodist. Peter Mandaville is a senior advisor of religion and inclusive societies at the United States Institute for Peace. He brings 25 years of academic, think tank, and government experience focusing on the intersection of religion, international affairs, and the Muslim majority world. At USIP, he leads an initiative focused on the security and peace-building implications of religion in the external relations of great powers, with a particular focus on the Western Balkans, Ukraine, China, and India. Thank you all for being with us today. I'm looking forward to this time of conversation and dialogue. To start off, going to turn to Paul. Paul, this is a twofold question. Can you tell us about Fund for Peace and how the organization has been supporting peace-building efforts and reducing conflict for over 60 years? And the second part is, Fund for Peace has been attentive to fragile and conflict-affected states since the Cold War and annually produces the Fragile States Index. What determines a fragile and conflict-affected state? What countries, regions are considered fragile and conflict-affected states? And are there early warning signs and symptoms that a country might be vulnerable? And how is the Fragile State Index being used for peace-building efforts? That's a lot of questions to throw at you.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to join the conversation. I will do my best to try and touch briefly on the questions, and could probably share some thoughts for several hours. But let me start by saying, again, I'm Paul Turner. I'm a middle-aged white male with brown hair and a short gray beard, sitting in my dining room. Behind me are a set of brown curtains, and I'm wearing blue tie, gray jacket, and a checkered shirt. So with regards to the Fund for Peace, we're constantly developing and applying practical tools and approaches for reducing conflict, and those are generally based on evidence as much as possible, or at least on lessons learned. We share those tools with the broader peace building community, whether that's information from our research or a new tool that facilitates inclusive planning. The Fund for Peace works to empower others, policymakers, practitioners, or communities with context-specific data-driven applications to diagnose risks and vulnerabilities and to develop solutions through collective dialogue. Whenever possible, we seek to do that through long-term sustained partnership with community leaders, civil society organizations, government agencies, or multinational organizations in order to help overcome the challenges that they're facing. Now, to shift into the multi-part question that's fairly complex. So I think that we can find fragility everywhere. It's obvious that it surfaces and manifests to different degrees. The types of definitions that different representatives within the peace building community hold around what is fragility have to do with this idea of exposure to risk and the lack of coping mechanisms in order to manage that risk. And depending on who you talk to, you're likely to get a much more erudite and complex set of definitions for that. But I think that's it when we boil it down to its essence. This fragility can take place at the personal, family, community, state, national, or even international level. And so we can see fragility in a lot of different places. And often one will lead to the next. I think it's good to note that there are different types of risks that we look at. And so with the Fragile States Index, we're looking at kind of 12 different families or buckets that we use to categorize risks. And so you may find a great amount of resilience in one area as you're looking at a particular country, but you'll also potentially find some high levels of fragility as well. And those different areas could be, for example, a particularly strong and dynamic economy, but some real concerns around the perceived legitimacy of a national government. We can find fragile countries on each continent. I think Australia might be a little bit of an exception. There's obviously some issues of fragility there, but on the whole, they're quite a strong and resilient country. And across those continents, I think we'll often find regions so that fragility isn't always constrained by national boundaries. I think there are often unexpected events when you're talking about how can we anticipate or predict fragility that disrupt the way that we're understanding the dynamics or the place that we're trying to understand. A really good example of that recently has been kind of the black swan event of COVID-19, which really just kind of grabbed the world by its collar and shook it around for a while. I think we're still recovering from that and will be potentially for the better course of a decade as we're coming to try and find ways to build resilience to help prevent that in the future. While it's a little bit difficult to predict those, you can monitor trends in fragility. And so you see countries becoming less fragile or more fragile over time. And I think that's one thing that our index can contribute to. And there are others that offer similar insights and analyses. We do our best to share that index with the public and hope that it can be used by policymakers to create more informed legislation that can potentially mitigate some of these risks. By academics to advance thinking and research in the field that helps the practitioners build peace more effectively, and by practitioners themselves to better understand the dynamics of the countries where they're working and to inform the design of the initiatives that they hope to implement.
Thanks so much, Paul, and for kind of starting us off on a understanding of where we're going with this conversation. The next question that I have is for Liz, and thank you so much. I know that you are you're not in the US right now, and where you are, it's in the evening. And so thank you so much for joining us it's nighttime there. But can you tell us about Alliance for Peacebuilding and how the organization does the work of building peace? And Paul kind of touched upon this, but it's related to COVID-19. The pandemic, revealed the underlying issues in many, perhaps all countries, that it is more than a health crisis. Can you speak on how it has impacted conflict-affected countries and any lessons learned?
There are many lessons learned about COVID and what happened. So I'll get to that in a second, but just I want to say thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm Liz Hume, and I am the Executive Director of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. Just to say, I am a middle-aged woman. I have brown hair with some highlights. I have a black shirt on, and I'm sitting here in a hotel room, but I have the background blurred a little bit because I'm in Geneva right now. So here for the Geneva Peace Week. So thank you for having me. So who is AFP? We are an alliance. We're a nonpartisan network of 170 plus organizations. The Fund for Peace is one of our members, and I'm a big fan of their work. I highly recommend everybody go on the Fragile State Index. I always spend a lot of time on there. I keep it up all the time. So our members are working in 181 countries to prevent conflict, reduce violence, improve lives, build sustainable peace. But really at our core, AFP cultivates a network to strengthen and advance the peacebuilding field, enabling peacebuilding organizations to achieve greater impact, really tackling issues too large for any one organization to address alone. AFP's network represents over 30,000 global peace builders, working to prevent and end violent conflict across 32 different areas of expertise, reflecting the diversity and difference of the peace building field. And that's kind of what does make the peace building field a little hard sometimes, because people are like, what actually, do you do? And so really at its core, it's about understanding what is driving conflict in conflict affected countries. And then more importantly, what do you do about it? How do you actually make sure that interventions are reducing conflict and building sustainable peace? So it's really trying to understand that, do a conflict assessment analysis. But it's not just about what's wrong, it's about so what? So what do you do about it? And this field really started growing in the 1990s. So it's still kind of a young field. But when it really started developing, it was about how do you work differently in countries? At the time when I was working at USAID, for example, 2/3 of the countries that the U.S. Agency for International Development was working in, those countries were either sliding into conflict, in conflict, or coming out of conflict. And we were still doing the same thing. Like, okay, let's bring our education tools, let's bring our health tools. But without understanding what was actually driving conflict and knowing that the work that was going in could be wiped out in no time if there was violence. So the Alliance for Peacebuilding has actually been, growing as our network has been growing as the field has been growing. And our new strategy really focuses on how do we advance the field? And it really focuses in on accelerating that collective action, creating standards and better evidence to prove that we actually can reduce conflict and build sustainable peace. Really making sure that laws and policies adapt and that we create more robust policies and laws that actually work. Make sure that funding is available and really shaping new narratives that reframe and rebrand peace building. One of the things we found is that when people think of peace building, they think of it as very passive and not active. And it might just be the absence of conflict. And that's not true. We know that it has to be very active. But that's kind of like a lot of words, right? So to put it in context, and you raised the COVID example, and this is something that I feel really strongly about. Right before COVID-19 hit, we were looking at the Ebola crisis in the DRC. And what happened is humanitarian health organizations rushed in there to address the Ebola crisis. And there was a conflict there. And health clinics were being bombed, and doctors were being shot at, and they didn't understand. They're like, but wait, we're coming here because, we're trying to help. And we were explaining that, but you have to understand the conflict dynamics, and you have to understand how you're viewed when you come in, and that some people, don't understand what you're trying to do. And you have to have a peace building lens on your work. We were just trying to address that when COVID-19 hit. So what did we learn about COVID? We now know that countries that had high levels of social cohesion, like countries like in Scandinavia, did really well on preventing and containing COVID-19 prior to the vaccine. We know that countries like the United States and others who have decreasing scores on social cohesion, and you can learn about that on the Fragile State Index. Actually, the United States has hit its 14th straight year in social cohesion going down, did poorly under COVID. Not only because they didn't trust institutions, they didn't want to wear masks if the government told them they had to, for example. They didn't trust these institutions. We didn't trust our neighbors. And what happened is also COVID-19, not only were conflict dynamics impacting how, if we could prevent or contain COVID, but it also contributed. We know that it caused conflict, whether, in a country in Africa or here in the United States. People fought over if they should wear masks. So not only did conflict dynamics contribute to us not being able to contain and prevent COVID, it also added to conflict dynamics. So I'll stop there, but I think that gives you kind of an example of what we learned under COVID.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answers. Hopefully we can learn from the lessons learned as we go forward. Peter, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us about the United States Institute for Peace and how the Institute works to prevent, mitigate, and resolve conflict? And the second part, religion can be such a powerful driver of violent conflict, but it can also serve as a resource for peace building. Can you speak on how religious actors and institutions have contributed to the prevention of conflict?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you very much, Amy, to you and Reverend Katie for convening us today and for the opportunity to have this conversation. So my name is Peter Mandaville. I'm Senior Advisor for Religion and Inclusive Societies at the United States Institute of Peace. I'm a middle-aged white male with brown eyes and absolutely no hair at all. And I'm sitting here in my well-lit office at the United States Institute of Peace with an embarrassingly empty bookshelf behind me because I just moved into the office. So the United States Institute of Peace is a nonpartisan public institution whose mandate and base funding comes from the United States Congress. It was established in 1984 and signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, and for the past 40 years has been pursuing a mission of preventing and mitigating violent conflict around the world. The Institute's initial work, as its name as an institute suggests, was initially focused on education and training. From the mid-1990s, particularly in the aftermath of the horrific wars in the former Yugoslavia, U.S. Institute of Peace began to engage directly in conflicts around the world by providing support to conflict settlement, mediation, and reconciliation processes. And our portfolio in that regard grew enormously starting in the early 2000s, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan. And today, our programmatic portfolio includes close to 80 countries, and we have a country presence in 17 countries around the world, including all major world regions. In addition to continuing the education and training work that has always been, in many ways, the lifeblood of our institute's work. We also do the sorts of research and policy relevant research and analysis that you might associate with other Washington, D.C. think tanks. But we also think of ourselves as a think and do tank insofar as that direct programmatic engagement with the world has become more and more central to the work of the Institute. And what that involves is providing support and resources to peace builders in various regions around the world. Our approach is one that tends not to involve, for example, the idea that we need to send American conflict resolution experts out to the world in order to fix the world's problems, but more the idea that the best peace builders will always be those who have roots and relationships within their local communities. And so what we do is to provide them with resources, knowledge, expertise, and various other forms of support to help them to do their work better and to do whatever they can to both prevent conflict and to help to resolve it as quickly as possible when it emerges. As a kind of quasi-governmental body, we do often work in close partnership with, for example, USAID, where both Liz and Paul have a professional background. We work very closely with the U.S. Department of State as well. And interestingly enough, more recently, we've developed some new lines of collaboration with the chaplaincy corps of the uniformed armed services of the United States. American military chaplains have increasingly found themselves called upon by their commanders in the field to offer advice about how American troops serving abroad should think about and engage with the religious landscape in the various settings in which they're deployed. So that's a line of work that we're also involved in. So Amy, you had asked more specifically about how we think about religion in relation to conflict and peace building. It's an opportunity to say something briefly about the kind of org chart of the U.S. Institute of Peace. We are divided primarily into a set of regional centers, so an Asia Center, an Africa Center, a Europe Center, a Latin America Center, but we also have a cross-cutting thematic center that holds within it a set of teams that possess particular technical expertise around issues like global accountability and criminal justice processes as they relate to conflict, international mediation and reconciliation and dialogue processes, but also religion. And I'm proud to say, particularly given the audience we have today, that the thematic team focused on religion is the oldest of all of the thematic teams at the Institute. It's been in existence since a few years after our finding. And indeed, the American peace churches played a very central role in the effort to establish USIP in the first place. The relationship between religion and conflict, as you alluded to in your question, is of course very, very complex. And I think we often here in Washington, D.C. find ourselves in an environment in which many of our partners in government tend to be rather skeptical and wary of religion. Viewing religion often primarily as a problem or a source of conflict or a conflict accelerant. This is certainly a perspective that I encountered frequently in a previous role that I had when serving in government at the Department of State, where I had the opportunity to be part of a team established by former Secretary of State John Kerry in 2013 to establish an office dedicated to increasing the ability of American diplomats to engage religious actors in order to advance kind of the full range of U.S. diplomatic objectives. And there was often a sort of hesitation and wariness to get into religion, sometimes because of legal concerns around the Establishment Clause that stipulates that there needs to be distance between the federal government and religion, but just sometimes also because I think religion was viewed with some hesitation and wariness. We've always been dedicated to the idea that that religion, is not inherently either positive or negative vis-a-vis conflict. In the hands of some individuals and groups, it can certainly be a source of conflict. But, and this is the dimension that we try to emphasize, religion also holds within it ideas and resources and capacities that can have a huge role in helping to prevent resolve and end conflicts around the world. And so that's the dimension of religion's role in peace building that we have tried to emphasize. There are distinctive models and paradigms of religious peace building that have been developed over the years. And so we engage and work with those technical specialists, if you will, to try and make sure that when we think about the broader endeavor of peace building, that religious actors and religious voices are engaged in that work. And as our conversation continues, I'll look forward to the opportunity to share a few examples of some specific and concrete work that we're doing in various countries around the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Our next question goes to Paul. Fighting for natural resources has often contributed to violent conflict, and climate change impacts every type of natural resource. How is climate change impacting the fragile and conflict-affected states? And how is Fund for Peace working with local and global policymakers and practitioners to address the issue of climate change? And Peter and Liz, feel free to jump in after Paul if you want to share a little bit more about USIP and AFP's role in working with climate change.
Sure. I think climate change is essentially changing those fights. Those will continue in places that aren't necessarily affected, at least in the near term, by climate change, but we're seeing those fights pop up in places where they didn't exist previously. And I think that it's affecting fragile or conflict affected states in a number of ways. For me, there's three that tend to rise to the surface. One is around issues of migration, the next around issues of impact on economies, and then finally around the grievances that people may generate towards their government because of changes. Now, I'll just speak to each one of those briefly. So I think with the influence or impact of droughts, floods, extreme weather events, et cetera, that are increasingly prevalent in parts of the world, that people are having to make life-changing, difficult decisions as to how they can care for themselves and their family in places that become almost impossible to live. And so they end up fleeing and moving. Sometimes they result in just moving within their country. Sometimes they are leaving their country to go elsewhere and crossing borders. And so these climate refugees, if you will, are really stressing the systems as they show up and try and create a new life for themselves. And I think that period of transition, those first few years are full of tension for everyone involved. I think in the long term, we see amazing contributions from refugees to their host nations, but there's some real tension as they stress systems. The next one in looking at economies, I think we're seeing those affected as we look at really obvious things, such as, if there's a drought, it's more challenging to produce food. And so we can look at supply chains and see how climate change is disrupting those, and also how those supply chains and the economies are affected by changing environments. So we're seeing vectors appear in places where they didn't before, and affecting populations and stressing healthcare systems as a result of climate change, where you've got malaria, which is appearing in places where it didn't previously, just as a quick example. And then finally, when I talked about grievances, I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of conflict isn't necessarily based on a fact. It's really based on the perception of the individual or of a group in terms of their lived experience. And so often climate change is shifting those dynamics in ways where it's a real challenge for the way that things have been done previously. And what I'm thinking about here is, the provision of government services. And as climate change disrupts some of those services, even if the government is able to kind of scramble and catch up fairly quickly, that disruption is unsettling to individuals. And so that degree of grievance, that frustration that might appear within individuals and communities really starts to become an issue, and increased levels of fragility there. Specifically with Fund for Peace and what we do, we're actually are doing a couple of research projects with Peter's institution at the U.S. Institute of Peace, looking at climate and security issues there, both how migration is affecting parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and then also how it is affecting some security issues related to the presence of violent extremist organizations. We think that it's really something that, as much as possible, should be included in peace building work, and that there are instances where it should be kind of front and center as a feature, and often should really be kind of a cross-cutting element that may be part of a governance program or of a microfinance program or something like that, that is really looking to explore ways that communities can, again, manage those risks, hopefully improve their degrees of resilience as they build peace and address some of these challenges that are presented by climate.
Thanks so much, Paul. Liz, I think you might want to add. Seems like.
Yeah, I just want to say climate change, this is something we've really been focusing in on. We say that climate change and conflict compound each other. They're not adding to each other, they're compounding each other. And exactly what Paul said, some of the countries that are going to be hit or already getting hit the hardest by climate change are also some of the countries that are most impacted by conflict and fragility. And so it's about, how do we look at what is going to happen, right? Look, if you're looking down kind of in the future, what do we do about that? How do we address risk so that governments can manage what's going to happen in advance? How do you also adapt? How does a country adapt? I mean, just to put it in context, what Paul was talking about, Ethiopia, for example, that's already experiencing violent conflict. Coffee is one of their #1 producers. Well, with a 1 degree change in temperature, coffee plantations are wiped out. Now, for you and I, that means when we go to Starbucks, we don't pick the Ethiopian brand. Maybe we'll pick the Kenyan brand. But for Ethiopia, that's their, biggest domestic, exporting product. So you're going to have to help them adapt as well. Otherwise, this will contribute to even more conflict that's happening there. So that's really, when you're talking about peace building and conflict, you're looking at those countries that where conflict or climate is going to contribute to conflict. And what do you do about it? How do you get ahead of it? So it's really that adaptation and that management.
Thanks so much, Liz. Peter, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say very briefly that the work of the U.S. Institute is organized around 4 thematic pillars, one of which is what we call global shocks, and that refers to precisely climate change, other issues related to the national environment, pandemics, large-scale financial shocks as well. And the intersection of the environment and peace building is an important growth area for us. And Paul already alluded to the very welcome partnership that we have with the Fund for Peace in that area. One thing that we've noted is that climate events often affect different communities in different ways, and that communities' ability to access remedy and services in the aftermath of these events is also uneven, and that can easily and quickly serve to recatalyze and reactivate pre-existing cleavages and social divisions that often fall out along ethnic and in some cases religious lines in certain countries, where it's not surprising that we're seeing an upsurge in intercommunal tensions and conflict in Pakistan, for example, following the horrific floods there in recent weeks and months. In Basra, in southern Iraq, where you had historically unprecedented levels of heat, several weeks this summer where the average daytime temperature was touching 120 degrees, wreaks havoc, as Paul mentioned, on the ability for basic services to be delivered. And when those services are delivered, sometimes, lo and behold, you would find a dynamic whereby, the Sunni neighborhood has electricity that the Shiite neighborhood doesn't, reactivating, sectarian dynamics. And so what we tried to do in our engagement around this issue is to work with religious leaders in order to tap into their capacity to help to preserve social cohesion and to repair the kind of fabric of society and community in the face of these kinds of shocks. Finally, just very briefly, I think writ large, I think we're all aware that there is a well-developed civil society coalition of organizations that are advocates for combating climate change and protecting the natural environment. I think it's not always those who are at the forefront of those are not always aware that within the faith-based world, there are also incredibly strong commitments to protecting the natural environment, understood in many cases as a religious obligation. And so I think one of the things we also need to look for is opportunities to cross-fertilize the energy and resources and commitment that found in the, loosely put, secular coalitions to combat climate change and protect the environment with the kind of work and activism and advocacy around those issues that's going on in the faith-based world.
Thank you so much for all of your answers to that question. The next question goes to Peter and is open to everyone that's on this panel. Over the past 2 decades, international organizations and the US government increased recognition of having greater gender equality. As global conflict and violence have been rising in recent years, so has gender-based violence and the threat of women's participation in peace building. What is at stake when we lose women's participation in peace building? And within some religious institutions, women are often not included in spaces of leadership. So how is USIP including women in its peace building efforts, especially in the religious sector? And what is being done and can be done to ensure that women's voices are included?
Oh, hugely important question, Amy, and thank you for raising it. It's a very complex one for us, right? Because there is an incredibly complex relationship between religion and gender in many faith traditions. The way that our team, USIP, has approached this work is to try to very intentionally cultivate what we call an inclusive model of religious engagement. And what we mean by this is that, yes, of course, we certainly want to work with and engage with those figures within religious communities and traditions and religious institutions who hold formal titles within, ecclesiastical hierarchies or within formal religious authority structures. They do, however, tend to be men. And in doing that, however, or in exclusively engaging with those who hold formal titles in religious structures and institutions, you run the risk of not recognizing the fact that in many religious communities, in informal spaces, women exercise enormous influence and authority in terms of shaping the ways that their communities think about the relationship between their faith and the world around them. And so we have developed a series of resources and networks that are focused very specifically on centering the role of women in peace building processes. So one of these, for example, is a project that we run called Religious Women Negotiating on the Front Lines. And this is a set of regionally based networks, literally global in scope, that pulls together women who have a track record and expertise serving as peace builders and conflict mediators, often in local settings in the countries and regions in which they're based, who we are able to bring to a variety of conflict settings around the world, and who are able to offer their advice and experience and best practices and solidarity to help make sure that women have the opportunity to be directly engaged. One space in which we're very active around these issues right now is Afghanistan, actually, and of course, the enormous challenges that women and girls face in Afghanistan following the takeover by the Taliban in August in 2021. So at the request of Rina Amiri, the US Special Envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights at the Department of State, USIP has been convening working groups composed of women activists and scholars from Afghanistan, some still in Afghanistan itself, others who have left the country in recent months, who worked together to come up with new approaches and tools for trying to creatively engage with Taliban authorities, often in very specific local settings in Afghanistan, around issues that pose risks to women and girls, from within a religious framework. And again, that cross-fertilization of their experiences, working with the other regional experts that we bring to bear, I think, is the kind of way that we try to, through these networks, to identify and bring to bear resources and tools that can make sure that the voices of women are present in peace processes, and that they are heard around the table when formal mediation and peace settlement processes are underway.
I just wanted to add one or two quick thoughts. Even though I'm only halfway through my career, I think one of the benefits of aging is perspective. And I've been able to see the issues of gender go from being, a requirement to check a box, literally, and throw in a paragraph at the end of ideas and concepts and proposals, to seeing proposals that are purely focused on the challenges of looking at issues of gender equity and equality. And I think we have a long way to go, but we've, as a community, I think have taken great strides in a positive direction. And just on wearing my data hat for just a minute to take a hard topic and talk about, again, some progress that's taken place. In a lot of countries, we see higher levels of gender-based violence. Part of the reason that we're noticing those now is because we've been able to establish, through working with the rule of law systems, through working with traditional leaders, et cetera, the ability to recognize and report those. And previously that didn't exist. So obviously that hasn't addressed the problem, but it has given us a better understanding of the extent of the problem and allowed us to be able to recognize what the challenges are in the fullness of those, in order to be able to engage and hopefully make progress.
Yeah, let me just pop in here and say, I just gave a keynote address at USIP on this very issue, and I was very positive there. I really do believe and hope, and women have a lot of agency, and I agree with Paul. There's been a lot of changes. I've been working in this field, for over 2 decades now, and I remember saying, hey, go get that gender paragraph and let's put it in the proposal at the very end. And it, and there's a lot of things that have happened. Just in this week, we celebrated 1325, the UN Resolution Security Council, the UN Resolution 1325, which mandated that the UN put in women had to be included in the peace and security process, for example. That was pretty much the overriding thought on that. Out of that framework came the Women, Peace and Security Act that Congress and the president signed in 2017. Now we're working really hard to make sure that that gets funded and it gets implemented. We know, for example, using the data, that when women are part of a peace process, when they are integrated and really part of it, have a seat at the table, those peace agreements over a 15-year period last longer. We also know that they care about more things about the community, not just, who wins and loses and who gets more power. They care about the actual drivers of conflict and how does a community heal, for example. So, you know, we know our own data also tells us that organizations that have diversity of leadership, you know, do better and are more innovative, right? So it only makes sense that we know that women being involved in processes. However, so there's a lot of positive there, and things are moving in the right direction. At the same time, there are some headwinds that we're coming up against. Under COVID, women's security, their safety, their economic equality declines significantly. We know, you know, Paul mentioned Afghanistan. Any gains that were made there have been wiped out. You know, we see what's happening in Iran right now. Women are protesting for, you know, not for the way that they're dressed and being, you know, dragged off to prison. So we're seeing a lot of backsliding, but it doesn't mean there isn't hope, and it doesn't mean that women don't have agency. But there is a lot of work to do. But I think, you know, the Women, Peace and Security Act is something that's practical and that we can, it has bipartisan support in Congress, and we are working hard to make sure that it gets implemented. And that's a really important piece of it. Just because you get a law in place doesn't mean it gets done. And that, I want to circle back to the COVID, for example. In both President Trump and President Biden, in their COVID strategy, they talked about the fact that peace building and conflict prevention needed to be part of the COVID strategy, but no resources went to it. So that, I think, is a really interesting piece. I mean, we talk about a lot of these things, and, you know, at AFP, we are, you know, part of these coalitions, we do this work, but just because something gets adopted or signed into law doesn't mean that it actually happens without organizations there, everyday people pushing for it.
Thanks so much for answering the question. Liz, this question actually goes back to you and it's open to everybody. Former President Trump signed into law the 2020 Consolidated Appropriations Act on December 20 of 2019, of which the Global Fragility Act is a part of. Earlier this year, President Biden announced the priority context for the implementation of the Global Fragility Act. What is the Global Fragility Act for people that are not familiar? And what is the goal of the Global Fragility Act? And how is it being implemented? And are you excited about it? And what is lacking?
Well, I'll tell a funny story about it. I started working on the Global Fragility Act back in early 2016. It was an idea that we started working with Congress and the Obama administration. This has been my life for the last since early 2016. Paul and Peter are probably laughing because they know this. So I dropped my daughter off at the University of Virginia, and we had taken her stuff there. We were driving back, and I was driving, so she had my phone, and I got a text, somebody from the State Department. It was about a problem that was happening with the Global Fragility Act. This was just this summer. And she read the text out to me and she said, "Is this thing not implemented yet? You've been working on this since I was in middle school." And she's now in college. She's going in her second year at UVA. So I think it's a really good example of how long something takes. So let me tell you why the Global Fragility Act came about. Because conflict in 2000, as we were creeping into, 2017 or 2016, 2017, we were seeing violence and conflict increase, not decrease. So we had to ask ourselves, whatever we're doing isn't working. In 2018, we had a 30-year high in global violent conflict. And this is before COVID, this is before Ukraine. We needed to look inside ourselves and see what we were doing wrong. And that's really where the idea for the Global Fragility Act came out of. We were originally calling it like the Violence Reduction Act, because it's something people could understand, that you can reduce violence and you can actually count it. You can kind of touch and feel that. And so that's really how it came about. Was at its core, we have to do something differently. We have to think about the way that right now in a strategy, pick any country, it doesn't matter. The US government funding goes in, it's already 90% earmarked, meaning they know where the funds are going to go. They're going to go to education, they're going to go to health, they're going to this, they're going to that. And the funding drives the strategy instead of the strategy driving the funding. So you go into country X and say, this is actually what's driving conflict. This is what's driving violence. Why don't we address those things? And no one's saying you can't do health and you can't do education and you can't do those things. But if you come in and you analyze all these issues and you're like, this is what's driving conflict. And you're like, okay, well, you have $500,000 to deal with that. $20 million is going to go to HIV/AIDS, but HIV/AIDS in this country has the number is tiny. And if you look at a budget like Ethiopia, that's what you would have seen, let's say, a few years ago. So that's really what it is as its core. It's about how do you do it differently? How do you ensure that there is some more funding in there? How do you take the strategy and actually focus it in on peace building and conflict prevention? For the first time ever, the US government has a strategy that in 5 priority areas, countries in a region actually do that. And I know, for people who haven't been working in this sector might think, well, that seems obvious, and I would agree with you, but that's not the way our system works. And that's why, in some ways, it is so innovative and so game-changing. But, again, changing a process, like I say, sometimes it's like moving the Titanic, right? This is a bureaucracy that's really, really strong. And it doesn't mean that there aren't great people there, and there are really good people in the US government. But it is going to take the risks and the challenges that we are facing. We have to adapt, and we have to have new tools, and be okay with saying what we have done in the past is not working. And so really, again, that's really what the GFA is about. It's about being adaptive. It's about seeing what works, what doesn't work. And again, having the funding drive the strategy. So I know that still sounds kind of like wonky policy talk, but it's really that easy. And as you can tell, I'm very excited about it because I've been working on it for so long, as my daughter reminds me.
I think it is a really exciting topic, Liz, when you can envision what a revision of the way that we do foreign policy could look like. And unfortunately, those things don't tend to happen overnight. And I know the whole community is really appreciative of your leadership and willingness to be the standard bearer in that. But I think everyone.
Oh, wait, can I just say one thing? And to you, Paul, but thank you, because we couldn't have done this without the data that organizations like yourself and the Fragile State Index, because 20 years ago, we had no data. We are able to do this because we have data like the Fragile State Index and can go and say, see, this is what is happening. So anyway, sorry, I just wanted to give you a plug there.
Thanks. But I think that the possibility that this holds is if we're able to offer proof of concept through this idea that Liz has championed, then my hope is that by the next generation, it won't just be applied in a small number of countries, but that this is the way that the US recognizes we should do business. Like, let's have the strategy lead us in the direction that it should, as opposed to letting interest groups and earmarks kind of take control and shape the way that we interact with the rest of the world.
right, Peter, do you want to, or we can move on to the,
No, I think we should move on.
okay. So this question is actually open to everybody. And so feel free to just jump right in and answer. We know that peace building is not a passive idea, but an active one. For those that are watching now and those that will be watching later, what can we do to advocate for peace building?
I can jump in as others are formulating their thoughts. I think that there's a lot of things that we can do kind of at the individual level, and then as we work within our communities. All of us, just as we are raised and as we attend school and exist in our communities, build basic skills of peace building, the active listening, the attempts to understand what's taking place around us, even mediation skills. And I think if opportunities present themselves, it's helpful to be able to kind of intentionally focus on refining those and to build peace in your own individual life and circles. I think that often we look at peace as being kind of the absence of violence, and a lot of the evolution of thinking. And in the United States, I think some of it stems from the influence of Martin Luther King Jr., but it's to really encourage us to look at peace, not just at the absence of violence, but where do we start to see justice and issues of equity and equality take place. And so there is a lot of room for us to be doing that work in our day-to-day lives. I think as Liz has referenced, there are a number of peace building organizations that are out there. You may come across those in everything from articles that are referencing their work in the news that you read, to a commercial on the television. And all of us, of course, would appreciate the support that could be offered financially, or even just through kind of the recognition of the effort that's taken place, because it starts to change societal values. And I think that it's important for the United States to really do some soul searching that needs to be driven by our religious leaders and communities, because we placed so much emphasis on the importance of security for so long. And I'm not suggesting that it's not important, but we have taken our eyes away from that preventative efforts that our forefathers, like Benjamin Franklin, in saying the short, simple quip of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've got the research now that shows the significant financial savings that can be achieved if we invest in peace building and conflict prevention efforts, as opposed to waiting for things to bubble up and for that smoke to become a fire, to where our military then has to come and our soldiers' lives are put at risk. And so I think that we need to do some real reflection as a country and as a world in terms of where our values are and how they're represented in the way that our governments are spending their money and how they're investing. And then lastly, I think almost every religious leader, and especially Jesus Christ, was outspoken in their commitment to peace, in pushing the religious institutions at the time and serving as an outspoken voice for peace, and not simply a rubber stamp for what existed. And there's a lot of, I think, rubber stamping that is taking place by the church writ large in the United States right now, where we've got, the voices that are speaking out in favor of nationalism and other really just here in the United States. And I hope that the United Methodist Church and so many others will join in really rising to the occasion, representing its values and trying to and serve as that voice for peace.
Peter, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So I mentioned these pillars that our institute built its work around, and one of them is the idea of a distinctively American approach to peace building. And we define that very much in relation to the values of this country. And when we're thinking about American peace building today, we here at the Institute are thinking of it very much in terms of what is it that this country and its history and its experience could bequeath to efforts to build peace around the world that is different from what other aspirants to global influence might be able to offer. And that values-based approach, of which we see religion to be an integral part, as you know, Paul just mentioned, is quite crucial to that. And that's kind of an easy, pithy talking point, but I think it actually has broader implications for how we think about the role of the United States in the world going forward. If we're entering into a period of world order in which the United States is not going to be the undisputed rule maker that defines the parameters and norms around which the international system is based, but is rather forced to contend with any number of other actors in the world that are vying for greater influence and power. We have to step back and ask questions about what our value proposition is. I think that in the conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and peace building space, that values-based approach is absolutely crucial to it, which means that our community's ability to embody those values and to bring them to the world is absolutely crucial. Paul mentioned the legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King. 2 years ago here at the Institute, again, at the direction of the US Congress, we created a new Gandhi King Academy, which is seeking to tap into the joint legacies of MLK and Mahatma Gandhi to make the case that the United States and paradigms of nonviolent action and nonviolent efforts to resolve conflict have been part of a broader global conversation over the last 100 years, and to develop new tools and models to carry that mission forward. And a lot of that Academy's work is very deliberately grassroots facing. It's about reaching out to American communities and making sure that American communities and American congregations have ways of being part of that conversation and helping to build and lift this country's capacity to bring about greater stability and peace around the world. And so, you know, this kind of takes me back to kind of Paul's injunction that you know, we all need to and can be part of it. It's not just the idea that there's these huge frameworks like Global Fragility Acts that are devised in Washington, and a passive American population sits back and wonders what that means and what that is and how do they relate to it. I think something that we need to do is to have something like a heartland strategy for the Global Fragility Act. You know, many Americans will have difficulty understanding, you know, what do Mozambique, coastal West Africa, someplace called Papua New Guinea, Haiti, what do they have to do with me and where I live and my problems and my issues? And so I think, you know, we need to do a better job of helping the American public to understand why this work is not just about, you know, fixing problems that seem to exist in the abstract out there, the way the world is wired and the way that the world works and the way that the global order is shifting. This is actually a set of work that is about the future of our country in that world, something that we're all invested in.
So yeah, Peter, I can't agree with you more. We actually need a US Fragility Act as well. And that's something that I've actually been saying. But one of the things we've put out some research on how do Americans think about peace building, because we're doing a really bad job at explaining what it is, making the case for it. And when I say we, I mean us, right? Sitting here. And so how do you do that? And we asked Americans about what do they think about peace building? How do we reframe it? How do we rebrand it? So what did we learn when we talked to everyday Americans, both Democrats and Republicans? That what resonates is the interconnectedness, understanding that what does happen somewhere else does impact us. And we don't have to go any farther than looking at what happened with the global pandemic. You know, we see what's happening in Ukraine is impacting. It's impacting food security. It's impacting energy security. You know, we see that. People can touch and feel that more. So it's really discussing that interconnectedness. Understanding that peace building isn't just a state. It's not a peace sign. It's not a state. It's not something that's passive. It's not something that is just in the absence of conflict, that it's active, and you have to be building it all the time. So using a bridge metaphor tends to work better with people. They understand you have to build it, you have to maintain it, you have to work with the people on the other side. So when you describe and explain peace building in those ways, this is how Americans understand it, or how it resonates with them. So it's something that we're actually starting to put into practice. One of the other things, though, that we have to do better at is stop with just the crisis messaging. You know, when we start with that and telling you how everything is so terrible, people's brains shut down, you know, and they want to go crawl under a table. But also being very clear and very practical, exactly what Peter was just saying, what you can do about it. You know, what you can do about it, even in your own community, for example. People have to have hope, and they have to have agency. They have to have knowing that they have power over something. So those are some of the things that we've learned just in the last, you know, couple of years. But really, you know, one of the number one things I do say is we have to stop with the crisis messaging. You know, look, we can't be naive and say, you know, everything's great, but, you know, we do have to say, okay, this is how we, you know, we work on it together.
Thank you all so much for your responses. And this is our last question before we go into a time of Q&A. You know, the three of you live, breathe peace building and for like 20 years and more, and living and breathing peace building, you're also living, breathing global conflict and violence. And it can be pretty discouraging. So where do you find your hope in the work that you do? Or do you find hope in the work that you do?
I was trying to let someone else go first, but I'll be the sucker to jump in and stick my foot in my mouth. So I think for me, it appears through a couple of different ways. If we look just at the field itself, and hopefully you've heard a couple of instances where we as practitioners feel like it's evolved and matured and grown. And so I think those challenges are also evolving, like violent conflict around the world is evolving as well. But I think that you know, the ideas that we're seeing now be part of the principles that so many organizations have adopted and are incorporating are just really hopeful. And so ideas like inclusion and localization that used to be, you know, at the core of only the most hardcore peace builders are now filtering out into the way that we do humanitarian assistance or international development and stabilization activities. And I think that some of those principles have begun to expand from peace building into interactions and foreign assistance writ large. And so I find some hope there. I think that the field is continuing to innovate and learn, and that is becoming increasingly welcome. I think when I first joined, there was a lot of a sense of you kind of figure things out just by spending time in the field and running into enough walls that you begin to learn how to avoid them. And now I think that while there's still that need to capture kind of the lessons learned and good practices, we've also got the real benefit and value of, you know, now decades of really aggressive scholarly academic research that is informing what we're doing, instead of it just being, you know, good intentions and somebody licking their finger and putting it up to the wind. I think everywhere I've been and deployed overseas, even in the most kind of broken places, have components of resilience that you can feel, and at the end of a long day help you go to bed and be ready to wake up and try again. And often that comes through the conversations that you have with, you know, the kid who's on their way to an outdoor school because their school building doesn't exist anymore, or with a faith leader who's doing all that they're able to do to keep their community together. But I think that those human touches in the day-to-day activities of what can be really heartbreaking are part of what have me, feel angry and sad, and to the point like that I can have a tear coming down my face now, but also really excited and energized and hopeful about what the future holds in store.
Yeah, I'll just say, it is hard sometimes. And I have to say, some of my darkest days, not too long ago, was Afghanistan. What happened not last August, the August before. I had worked out there. I had told women in Pakistan to go back, and we were going to be there, and we were going to fight and get your country back. And I felt so much personal guilt. If I had to go, back again, I would have told them, don't go, and so there are days like that, there are days that you say to yourself, I've changed policies, I have actually gotten funding to countries. I've implemented programs where I've seen conflict stopped. People's, lives were changed. But, it doesn't mean that, we've also seen a lot of really bad stuff. But I guess what I hold on to is that conflict is inevitable. If we sit here long enough, we're going to disagree on something, one of us, and, I'll think Paul's wrong about something or anything. I'm kidding. I always think Paul's right. But violent conflict is not inevitable, and we can prevent it. And that, I think, is something that gives me hope and keeps me going. The conflict dynamics in the United States are not good right now. Grievances are going up, violence is going up, resiliency is going down. But I have to have hope. I have to believe that there are enough good people in this country that no matter what we believe or don't believe, that violent conflict is not the answer. So if I didn't believe that, I couldn't do what I do.
So I'll start by acknowledging, as Liz did, that I often have great difficulty finding hope right now, for reasons that I think will be familiar to many of us, just given the state of the world right now and the traumas that we have all been living with and living through. And what saddens me most, I think, is it's not that we don't have the capacity to imagine different futures or to know what some of the solutions might be, almost in a technical sense, but the mechanisms and processes through which we would usually pursue those alternatives, I think, are fundamentally broken. And it certainly does have a lot to do with the shape of political discourse and the political process in the United States right now, but it's not confined to the United States by any means. And that rather sort of dark offering is actually part of the pathway to getting towards where I do find some hope. And this is probably what this audience is going to sound like pandering, but I actually do find it in religious spaces. And not to get too confessional, it's not because I myself am particularly religious. I'm not. But my professional life has been made in religious spaces simply because, by virtue of my own background, being born and raised in a part of the world in the Middle East where religion sort of dictates the rhythm and ambiance of everyday life. And as a social scientist who has come to recognize and appreciate the centrality of religion as a social force in the world, where I find hope is in the idea that there are still spaces in the world, such as religion, where there's a capacity to stand apart from the prevailing order and ask certain kinds of questions that cannot or will not be asked by other sectors today. A lot of this has to do with the ways in which, it used to be possible historically to posit something called the public good. And usually we relied on public spaces, governmental institutions to be the custodians of that. And then there was another space called capital and markets where we made money. And one of the roles that the public good people do was to create regulatory frameworks to make sure that the process of accumulating capital didn't pose too much harm and threat to the public good. I think these two things have become completely collapsed right now, such that the logic of public good usually is subservient to the logic of capital, and which means that there's no space, there's no ways in which these things can be checks on each other. Religious spaces, I think, offer vocabularies, worldviews, frameworks in which it's still possible to stand apart from that order and ask questions. It's not to say that religion is not itself and has not historically been implicated in political power, certain kinds of alliances with power and money. That's obviously the case, but I still think that there's possibilities there in religious engagement and religion as a phenomenon to serve as a moral authority and to bear witness and to force us to confront certain things that are going on in ways that other sorts of actors are not permitted to engage and raise. And so that's why I still have some hope.
Wow. Thank you so much, Paul, Peter, and Liz, for just sharing your profound commitment to this work, the research, the data, the policies that have been just so incorporated into your work and your passion and commitment to peace. It's very clear and evident how much of your heart you put into this work. So thank you so much for that offering. We're transitioning to our Q&A time, and I'm going to pause to just give my physical description for those who need it for accessibility purposes. I'm a Mexican-American woman with brown hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a navy blazer and I'm sitting in my office, so there's a bookshelf in the background. Now moving back to Q&A. Many of the questions that our participants had, you guys were actively just answering them throughout the conversation, but I think this one goes most specifically to Liz. And it's a question about how do we monitor the funds, the dollars that we give to things like the Global Fragility Act?
Sure. And I think that's, it's a concern. I understand it's people's tax paying dollars. One of the things I want to say, people, I do ask the question when I'm teaching a class or something and say, how much money do you think goes to foreign assistance? And some people will say, 10%, 15%, 20%. Our budget for foreign assistance is less than 1%. I think it's even less than that. Isn't it like less than half of something like that? I haven't looked at it in a long time. It's really, it's small in comparison. So I first want people to know that, but I do understand. I mean, I'm a taxpayer, I get it. So what do we do? Money, first of all, there's procurement rules in terms of, even let's say Paul, for example, Paul's organization gets US government funding. I think you do, but they have to write a proposal, say what they're going to do. It can even be a contract. Sometimes it's a grant. You have to write reports, explain what you do, what you didn't do. You have to follow the same, procurement and accounting rules that any government contractor would have to follow. You have USAID for foreign officers, out in Mozambique or whatever. You have contracting officers out there. This money gets tracked. Now, do some things happen? Of course they do. But you also have the Office of Inspector General that, people can put in a complaint on. When I was at the US government, I have referred something to the Office of Inspector General, for example. People take this really seriously because it is tax-paying dollars. It is money. You don't want it to go to waste. And more importantly, you want it to do the right thing. So. And there's also Congress. They'll haul you up and have a hearing on it too.
Thanks for naming those accountability measures, just so that we can be mindful of them in our role in kind of monitoring and being aware of how to participate as a civil society. The next question is for all y'all. From the framework of your organizations, how do you work to protect the rights of religious and ethnic minorities and racial minorities? How do you care for these frontline communities in advocating and advancing the peace work that you do and the peace research that you gather? Peter, would you like, or Paul's ready to go?
I was going to say Peter surely should lead on this one. But...
Sure. No, absolutely happy to. And thank you very much for the question. The promotion of religious freedom and protection of religious minorities is necessarily central to the work that we do at USIP, particularly on the religion team, because if what you're trying to do is to tap into the potential of religious actors in contributing to peace, there has to be space for them to be able to be present in society and to do the things that they can do. And so when you encounter spaces where there is suppression, discrimination, or in some cases outright violence committed against particular religious groups or particular religious communities, then this obviously has a very practical and direct impact on our capacity to do the work that we do. So in addition to the idea that protecting religious freedom is core to the broader human rights agenda, after all, protection of religious freedom or freedom of religion or belief, is one of the components of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in addition to protecting religious freedom as a value, it has very practical implications for the work that we kind of do. But there's been some challenges we've had. Promoting religious freedom has been an explicit component of US foreign policy since 1998, when the US Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which mandated the US State Department to create an office focused on religious freedom and to issue annual reports describing the state of religious freedom around the world. And later we brought into force various mechanisms that serve to try to hold countries that were violating religious freedom accountable for their actions. I think that there are ways in which domestic partisan politics and political polarization in the United States, the domestic politics of religious freedom, if you will, has seeped into the way that we think about this work abroad in ways that risks disrupting a strong bipartisan consensus around the importance of promoting religious freedom. And as it happens, I and a good friend and colleague here at USIP, Knox Thames, who worked for many years at the State Department at the US Commission for International Religious Freedom, just issued a report last week through USIP on how to ensure that promoting religious freedom remains a central tenet of US national security policy, and how to make sure that we don't break that long-standing bipartisan consensus around the value of this work and its contributions to stability and peace building.
I'll jump in and give another couple of examples just so people can kind of see different entry points or things that are taking place around the world. So at the Fund for Peace, we recently concluded a report that was commissioned by the Radiant Foundation that was looking at the nexus of the freedom of religion and freedom of the press, because they are hoping that they can make arguments that kind of corporate entities with religious backings can actually be actors for good in helping promote peace and dialogue within societies, whether those are fairly stable or quite fragile countries. Another thing that we do with the Fund for Peace is we've been working primarily in Western Africa, originally in Nigeria, and then across 15 different member states to either set up or to refine early warning systems. And what that means is having individuals and communities being able to share when things start to get tense. In Nigeria, there's been intermittent high degrees of conflict that have surfaced between Christian and Muslim communities there that often kind of fizzle out fairly quickly, which is a big relief because that could go south and have a massive impact across the region. Beyond that, we've been working across those 15 other countries to try and help establish the abilities for communities and for countries to be able to share areas of concern up to a regional body called ECOWAS, which is kind of like the European Union, if you haven't heard of it. And then with that, the ability for ECOWAS to work with national governments and sometimes civil society at the community level to be able to provide a response to those increasing risks or increasing threats to stability and peace. And often those are rooted in religious tensions that typically will have multiple dynamics. So not just religion, but also sometimes tribal affiliations or political parties that are co-opting religion, etc. And so you end up seeing multiple identities that are fueling these low levels of conflict that hopefully will increasingly be disrupted through early response capabilities.
Thanks, Katie, for leading the Q&A session. A sincere thanks to our panelists, Liz, Paul, and Peter, for sharing your expertise with us today, not just information, but it was very clear your passion and your heart's calling being in this conversation with you today. I'm so thankful for each of you and that you guys are doing the work of peace building and we can join you in it. A few announcements before we close for today. There'll be a slide going up in a few minutes, but please consider taking action on these legislative asks related to peace building. These legislative asks can be found on our website under the advocacy page, or you can do so now by scanning the QR code with your phone, and it will take you directly to the Take Action page. The links will also be included in the follow-up email at the end of the webinar series, along with all of the links and resources that were dropped in the chat today. We offer these educational resources not just to learn and to have knowledge, but to act and to advocate. So I hope that you do that today. We have one more webinar in our series tomorrow. And if you haven't registered for tomorrow's webinar series, it's not too late to register, so please do so. And again, you can use the QR code on this slide to register. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you also for joining us today and have a great day. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you all so much. Thank you again. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.